Three women vanished before morning. By the time the sun rose over Springfield, Missouri, three women had disappeared from a house that still looked as though they might return at any moment. Their cars were there, their purses were there, their keys, clothing, money, cigarettes, and the family dog had all been left behind. Inside, there was no obvious wreckage, no blood, and no scene of violent struggle. Cheryl Levitt, her daughter Suzanne Streeter, and Suzanne's friend Stacy McCall had simply ceased to be where every ordinary detail suggested they should have been. Suzanne and Stacy had graduated from Kickapoo High School the previous day, June 6, 1992. They spent the night moving through graduation celebrations before eventually deciding to sleep at the home Suzanne shared with her mother. Investigators would later place their return sometime around 2:15 a.m. Cheryl had been heard from earlier that night at approximately 11:15 p.m. when she spoke with a friend. By the time Suzanne and Stacy returned, there was every reason to believe Cheryl was already home. What happened inside the house after that point has never been established. There is no surviving witness account describing footsteps in the hallway. No one has ever testified that a voice came from the darkness. No official record says that something was waiting inside before Suzanne and Stacy arrived. But the absence of witnesses is the central terror of the Springfield Three, because whatever occurred happened during a sealed stretch of darkness in which three people entered an ordinary home and none of them came out to explain what followed. And if the horror did not arrive with them, there is another possibility. It was already there. The house would have looked harmless when Suzanne and Stacy reached it in the early morning. The celebrations were over, the noise of graduation parties had fallen behind them. Springfield had gone into that peculiar silence found in residential neighborhoods after midnight, when parked cars sit beneath streetlights and dark windows offer no indication whether the people behind them are sleeping. The girls were tired. They had spent hours surrounded by voices, music, friends, plans, and the electric restlessness of graduation night. Now, there was only the soft closing of a car door, the sound of shoes crossing toward the entrance, and the familiar shape of home. Nothing outside needed to move. Nothing needed to follow them up the walk. Inside, Cheryl had already gone to bed. Her bedroom would later appear as though it had been slept in, one of the quiet details investigators were left to interpret after she disappeared. The house itself would show no clear signs of a struggle. Whatever happened did not leave behind the kind of destruction expected when several people are forcibly removed from their home. That is what makes the imagined first minutes after the girls arrived so difficult to shake. Suzanne would have known the sounds of that house. A refrigerator cycling on, pipes shifting inside the walls. These small mechanical noises houses make when everything else becomes quiet enough to hear them. She would have known where the floor gave slightly beneath a footstep. She would have known the sound of her mother moving from one room to another. She would have known which shadows belonged to furniture and which dark shapes disappeared when a lamp was switched on. So perhaps there was nothing alarming at first. Perhaps Suzanne and Stacy spoke quietly because Cheryl was sleeping. Perhaps jewelry was removed, shoes were set aside, clothes from the long evening were abandoned where they would later be found. The accumulated energy of graduation night slowly drained away. Then the lights went out. The house settled, and for a short while, nothing happened. Sometime near 3 in the morning, Suzanne opened her eyes. There had been a sound. Not a crash, not breaking glass. Something smaller, a floorboard. She remained still. Beside her, Stacy did not immediately move. The room was dark enough that familiar objects had lost their edges. The doorway was a darker rectangle against darkness. Somewhere deeper in the house, the refrigerator gave its low electrical hum. Then came another sound. A step, slow, controlled. It came from the direction of the living room. Suzanne listened. Another step followed, then another. Someone was walking toward the hallway. There was no reason for that to frighten her. Her mother was in the house. People woke during the night. They went to the bathroom. They checked doors. They got water. Suzanne waited for the ordinary sounds that would explain it. A faucet. A cabinet. The refrigerator door. Nothing came. The footsteps continued. They were too slow, not the soft, wandering movement of someone half asleep. Each step seemed separated from the next by several seconds, as though whoever was walking had stopped after every movement to listen. Suzanne lifted her head. Stacy stirred. Neither spoke. The footsteps reached the hallway, then stopped. The silence afterward felt different from the silence before. Before, the house had been empty of activity. Now it felt occupied. Suzanne turned toward the bedroom door. No shadow moved beneath it. No hand touched the knob. She could hear Stacy breathing beside her, shallow now, awake enough to understand that something was wrong. Then a voice came from the other side. Quiet, close, almost against the door. "Don't come out." Suzanne froze. It was Cheryl's voice, not merely similar, her mother's voice. Low enough that it sounded intended for Suzanne alone. There should have been relief in hearing it. Instead, Suzanne looked toward the wall beside her. Cheryl's bedroom was on the other side. And when Suzanne and Stacy had come home, her mother had been there, sleeping. The voice outside the door whispered again, "Don't come out." Stacy slowly pushed herself upright. Suzanne lifted one hand without turning toward her, a small movement asking her to remain still. Beyond the door, something shifted its weight. A faint pressure moved across the floorboards, then silence. Suzanne waited for her mother's bedroom door to open. It did not. She waited for Cheryl to call again. Nothing. The dog should have reacted. Perhaps that was the worst part. Animals often become part of the mythology around unexplained disappearances because people imagine them sensing what humans cannot. But there is something worse than a dog barking into darkness, a dog refusing to bark at all. Somewhere outside the bedroom, Claus made a faint, nervous movement against the floor, then stopped. Suzanne stared at the doorknob. It did not turn. A minute may have passed, or only seconds. Fear distorts time in dark rooms. Stacy leaned closer. Suzanne could feel her breath. Neither woman needed to say what both understood. If Cheryl was in the next bedroom, then the thing standing outside Suzanne's door had used her voice, and it knew exactly whose voice would keep the door closed. Then another sound came from the hallway, a bedroom door opening. Not theirs, Cheryl's. The movement was slow enough that the hinges barely complained. Suzanne stopped breathing. A moment later came her mother's real voice. Not from outside their door. From farther down the hall. Sleep-heavy. Confused. A few quiet words that neither girl could make out. Then silence. The kind of silence that arrives when someone has seen something they do not understand. Cheryl did not scream. No furniture overturned. No desperate running followed. There was only a soft movement in the hallway, and then what sounded like a breath drawn sharply through the nose. A whisper followed. This time, Suzanne could not tell whose voice it was. Then came 3 gentle knocks on her door. Not loud, not urgent. 3 evenly spaced taps. Suzanne did not move. Stacy covered her mouth. The doorknob turned. Slowly. It stopped when the latch caught. Whoever stood outside did not force it. Instead, Cheryl's voice came through the door once more. "It's okay." The voice was calm now. Too calm. "Come out." Suzanne stared at the wall separating her from her mother's bedroom. There was no sound from that room anymore. The hallway waited. The voice repeated the invitation. "Come out." And somewhere closer to the floor came the faint, nervous movement of the dog. Then a sound from the front of the house. Glass breaking, small, brittle. A porch light globe would later be found shattered outside, one of the few unusual physical details repeatedly associated with the home that morning. It would be cleaned up before investigators could examine the scene in its untouched condition. Inside the bedroom, Suzanne and Stacy remained motionless. The voice did not speak again. Instead, footsteps began retreating down the hallway. Suzanne listened as they moved toward the living room. One step, another, another. Then they stopped. A second set of footsteps followed, lighter, Perhaps Cheryl. Perhaps not. Then a third. For several seconds, there were movements from different parts of the house, impossible to separate. A door opened. Cool, early morning air moved somewhere beyond the bedroom. The dog made a thin sound. Then, everything became quiet again. Suzanne finally reached for the door. Whether she opened it willingly, whether someone opened it from the other side, or whether the room had already become empty, belongs to the darkness that history never recovered. By 7:30 a.m., the window established by the Federal Bureau of Investigation had closed. Cheryl Levitt was gone. Suzanne Streeter was gone. Stacy McCall was gone. Morning did what morning always does. It made the world look normal. The house remained standing. Sunlight reached the rooms. Cars remained outside instead of disappearing with their owners. Personal belongings stayed inside. Cheryl's bed showed signs of having been slept in. There was no clear scene of a violent fight waiting for police. Springfield authorities would describe the home as showing the appearance that the women had been abducted, yet the physical explanation for how 3 people vanished from it remained absent. Friends and family came looking. Doors opened. People walked through rooms that had unknowingly become a crime scene. Objects were touched. The house filled again with human voices. But the 3 voices everyone wanted to hear were missing. That absence became larger with every hour. The investigation expanded. Springfield police received assistance from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and other agencies. Leads accumulated. Years became decades. No confirmed explanation restored the missing hours. No discovery brought the 3 women home. The Federal Bureau of Investigation continues to list Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Streeter, and Stacy McCall as having disappeared from the Springfield residence during the early morning hours of June 7, 1992. And the house remains terrifying for a reason far simpler than any ghost story. Something happened there. Something capable of removing 3 people while leaving behind nearly everything that represented their ordinary lives. Maybe the danger came through the door after Suzanne and Stacy arrived. Maybe someone they trusted was responsible. Maybe an explanation exists that is entirely human and has simply remained hidden. But the darker possibility begins several minutes earlier, before the footsteps, before the whisper. Before anyone knew, there was a reason to be afraid. It imagined Suzanne and Stacy coming home after graduation, entering the familiar rooms, locking away the noisy world outside, and believing they were safe because Cheryl was asleep nearby. It imagines the front door closing behind them, the girls moving through the house, the lights going dark one by one, and somewhere beyond the bedrooms, in a room they had already passed without looking closely enough, something standing perfectly still, listening, waiting for the house to become silent, waiting until everyone believed they were alone. Then, sometime near 3 in the morning, placing one careful foot onto the hallway floor, and using a mother's voice. The family that never came down the mountain? There are places in southeastern Oklahoma where the roads seem to thin out before the land does. Pavement becomes gravel, gravel becomes red dirt, telephone poles disappear behind ridges, and the wooded slopes of the San Bois Mountains close around the road until the world beyond them feels impossibly far away. In October, the trees carry the dry smell of leaves and cold soil, and when the sun drops behind the ridges, darkness gathers beneath the branches long before the sky itself turns black. It was into that country that Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their young daughter Madison traveled in October of 2009, looking for a place where they might begin again. The Jamisons lived near Eufaula, Oklahoma. Bobby was 44, Sherilyn was 40, their daughter Madison was 6. What drew them into Latimer County was land, roughly 40 acres of remote mountain property they were considering purchasing. Relatives would later describe the family as wanting privacy and peace, something away from other people. On October 8, 2009, they traveled toward the mountains to inspect property near Red Oak. They would never be seen alive again. The official record can follow them only so far. The darker story begins where that record becomes silent. In the version that grew around their final trip, the parcel had first attracted Bobby because of its price. Land that isolated was not necessarily valuable, but the asking amount still seemed strangely low for the acreage. There was timber, there were open patches where a small house could stand. There was enough distance from the nearest neighbors to provide exactly the quiet the family wanted. It looked less like a bargain than the sort of mistake people hurry to claim before somebody corrects it. The owner supposedly did not try to negotiate much. There was only one warning. They should be gone before the sun went down. Nothing dramatic accompanied the warning. No story about murder, no tale about missing hunters, no explanation of strange lights or voices in the woods. The instruction was delivered with the flatness of someone mentioning a washed-out road. Bobby could look over the property as long as he wanted, he could walk the ridge, he could bring his family, but when evening came, they were not to remain there. A warning without an explanation is easy to dismiss in daylight. The Jamisons drove into the mountains with Madison and their small dog. Behind them, Eufaula receded into ordinary distance. Ahead, the road curled through timber and low ridges, past stretches where tree branches leaned over the track and filtered the afternoon sunlight into moving pieces. The farther they traveled, the weaker the signs of habitation became. Mailboxes disappeared, driveways became uncommon, the forest pressed closer, the air would have been different from town, cooler beneath the trees, damp where the ground remained shaded. There would have been the smell of leaf mold, pine, exposed stone, and the faint mineral scent of dirt disturbed by tires. Sound carried unevenly there. A snapping branch could seem close when it was far away. A bird calling from another ridge could arrive without any sense of direction. And silence could become so complete that the closing of a truck door sounded unnatural. According to the darker telling, the family began walking the parcel while there was still plenty of daylight. Bobby looked at clearings and slopes, trying to imagine where a house might stand. Sherilyn stayed near Madison as they moved through uneven ground. Their daughter wandered only a short distance at a time, drawn toward leaves, stones, and whatever small discoveries children notice while adults are studying boundaries. There were no fences marking every edge. There were no neat signs telling them where one piece of land ended and another began. Only woods. At first, the old structure looked like part of those woods. Bobby noticed an angle that did not belong among the tree trunks. Something straight where everything else was crooked. When he moved closer, the shape became a wall. There was a house standing farther into the property. It was not the kind of abandoned farmhouse that remained visible from a county road. Trees had grown around it closely enough that branches scraped its roof, dead leaves had accumulated against the foundation, the boards had weathered to the gray of old bone, and sections of the roof sagged beneath years of rain and heat. There was no maintained path leading toward it. The house should have been mentioned. That was what made it wrong before anything else did. The documents Bobby had studied concerned vacant land. Nothing in the information given to him had prepared the family for a standing structure hidden inside the timber. He moved toward it anyway. The porch gave slightly beneath his weight. Somewhere underneath, wood produced a slow cracking sound and then became still. The windows were dark enough that they reflected the trees rather than revealing the rooms beyond them. One pane was missing. Cold air breathed through the opening, carrying the odor of wet lumber and something stale from inside. Sherilyn remained close. Madison followed. The front door was not locked. Inside, the temperature seemed to fall immediately. Light entered through gaps in boards and broken windows, but it did not travel far. Dust hung motionless in narrow beams. The floor was layered with dirt, fragments of leaves, and stains left by years of moisture. There should have been signs of animals, droppings, nesting material, the scratch of something retreating through a wall. Instead, the place felt empty in a more deliberate way. The first room contained almost nothing. Almost near the middle of the floor were 3 chairs. 2 were full-sized wooden chairs. The third was made for a child. They were not stacked against a wall. They were not overturned among discarded furniture. They were arranged with space between them facing the same direction. 2 adults, 1 child. There was no 4th chair. No pile of extras, no table. Just 3. Madison was 6 years old. In the gloom, the small chair would have reached approximately where her knees bent. The room beyond the chairs was darker than the rest of the house. A doorway opened into it, but afternoon light did not penetrate far enough to show what waited inside. The family could smell old wood, damp plaster, and another odor beneath them, faint and difficult to place. It had the heaviness of a room that had been shut for years. Then, something moved deeper in the house. Not quickly. A single sound came from somewhere beyond the doorway. Wood accepting weight. A floorboard bending beneath a step. Bobby listened. Nothing followed. Outside, wind moved through the trees, but inside the house, the air remained still. Sherilyn called Madison closer. A second sound came from farther inside. This time, there was no mistaking its rhythm. Pressure. Release. Pressure again. Someone walking slowly across a floor they could not see. The family had entered through the front. No one had passed them. The windows they could see were broken or sealed with age. There was no vehicle outside, no smoke from the chimney, no sign that anyone lived there. Still, the footsteps continued. They moved once, stopped, then moved again, closer. Bobby backed toward the door. That was when Madison looked at the 3 chairs. The child's chair was no longer facing the same direction as the other 2. It had turned slightly toward her. Nobody had touched it. They left the house. Outside, the mountain light had changed. The sun was still above the horizon, but in the narrow valleys between ridges, evening had already begun. The forest had lost its warm color. Tree trunks had become dark vertical shapes. Long shadows crossed the ground, joining one another beneath the brush. The owner's warning returned with a different meaning. Be gone before sunset. Bobby led them back toward the truck. That should have taken only minutes. Instead, the woods seemed to stretch. A slope Bobby remembered descending appeared to rise in front of them. A narrow opening between trees led into thicker brush. The sounds of their own movement became unnervingly loud. Boots crushing leaves, branches brushing clothing, Madison's smaller steps hurrying between her parents. Then another set of steps joined them, far behind. When they stopped, it stopped. When they moved, it moved. Bobby turned more than once and saw nothing. The footsteps did not rush. They did not need to. They simply followed. By the time the family reached their pickup, the remaining light was draining from the sky. The dog was placed inside. Personal items remained in the vehicle. In the documented case, investigators would later find wallets, phones, cash, and other belongings there, along with the family's dog, alive but severely malnourished. Those abandoned possessions became some of the most haunting evidence in the entire disappearance because they suggested that whatever took the Jamisons away from their truck was not something they had prepared for. But according to the mountain story, they did not immediately drive away. Something had appeared on the road ahead. At first, it looked like a person standing between the trees. The figure was too far away for a face to be visible. It remained absolutely still where the dirt track curved through the woods. Bobby watched. The figure did not approach. Sherilyn watched. The figure did not move. Then Madison turned toward the trees behind the truck. There was another shape there. The same height. The same stillness. The family was no longer looking at a person blocking the road. They were looking at 2. Darkness thickened beneath the branches. The forest went quiet. No insects, no birds. No wind. From somewhere uphill came a sound impossible to confuse with an animal. A wooden chair scraped slowly across a floor. What happened after that has never been established. Searchers later found the Jamisons' pickup abandoned in the mountains. The family's dog was still inside. Their personal belongings had been left behind. Cash remained in the vehicle. The 3 people themselves had vanished into terrain that teams would search without finding them. For years, there was no body, no confirmed witness to their final moments, and no explanation that could account for why an entire family had walked away from a vehicle containing things they would normally have taken with them. The mountains kept them. Autumn passed. Winter followed. Then another year, and another. Rain washed through the valleys, leaves covered old tracks, summer growth thickened over the slopes. Whatever evidence might once have remained in the soil weakened beneath weather, animals, and time. Nearly 4 years passed before hunters entered a remote section of Latimer County in November of 2013 and found skeletal human remains. There were 3, 2 adults, 1 child. The site was less than 3 miles from where the Jamisons' pickup had been discovered. Months of forensic work followed, and in July of 2014, the Oklahoma medical examiner confirmed that the remains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. Finding them did not solve what had happened. Their remains had been exposed too long. The medical examiner could not determine how the family died. There was no final explanation hidden in the bones, no clear wound that closed the case, no single finding that reconstructed their final hours in the mountains. Their deaths remained undetermined. And so the space between the abandoned truck and the place where the remains were found remained what it had always been: dark, wooded, silent. A distance small enough to walk, yet large enough to contain an answer that years of searching never recovered. The official story ends there. The other story returns to the house. It imagines the structure still standing somewhere behind the trees, absent from property maps, its roof sinking a little farther every winter. Rain enters through broken boards. Leaves blow through the doorway. The rooms remain empty, except for the front room. There, beneath layers of dust, sit 3 chairs. 2 for adults, 1 for a child, and in that telling, the most frightening question is not why the chairs were waiting for the Jamisons, it is why there were exactly enough. The man waiting in the attic. For months, people heard something moving inside the house on West Moncrief Place in Denver. Food disappeared, objects were found where no one remembered leaving them. Sounds came from rooms that were supposed to be empty. Later, after the house itself stood vacant, neighbors still reported movement inside and odors that should not have been there. The explanation would eventually prove worse than the ghost story forming around the property. There was no restless spirit wandering those rooms. There was a living man hidden above them. And before anyone knew he was there, the owner of the house was already dead. His name was Philip Peters. He was 73 years old, a retired employee of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, and a musician who had belonged to the Denver Guitar Club. Peters and his wife Helen had lived in their Denver home for more than 3 decades. They were known through music as well as through the ordinary connections that accumulate when people remain in one neighborhood for years. The house was familiar, established, the kind of place where a strange sound could normally be blamed on settling wood, a pipe, or an old door. In the autumn of 1941, however, the routines inside that house had changed. Helen had broken her hip and was recovering at St. Anthony's Hospital. For approximately 5 weeks, Philip remained at the house without her. Neighbors knew he was alone. They invited him to dinner in the evenings and sent him home with leftovers for the following day. His isolation was noticed, but it was also watched over. People expected to see him. They expected him to arrive when invited. That ordinary concern would eventually lead them into the house after something terrible had happened. What no one around Peters understood was that another man had already entered the pattern of the home. Theodore Coneys was an acquaintance from years earlier. He had known Peters through the Denver Guitar Club. By 1941, Coneys was living on the margins, frequently without stable shelter and struggling with poor health. He later told police that he went to the Peters home hoping for money or food. When he arrived and found no one there, he entered the house. Somewhere inside, he discovered access to a cramped space above the occupied rooms. The opening led into an attic cubbyhole so confined that later accounts described it as only 27 inches high and 57 inches wide. It was not a room where a person could stand upright and move normally. It was a concealed pocket of darkness above a household that continued functioning beneath it. Coney's stayed. From that point forward, the geography of the Peters home changed without Philip Peters knowing it. There were the visible rooms where an elderly man ate, rested, dressed, and waited for his wife to recover. Then there was the hidden space above those rooms, occupied by someone who knew that discovery could end everything. Coney's learned when he could descend. When Peters was away, food could be taken. The house could be entered from above rather than from outside. Then the intruder could disappear again through the small opening and leave the ordinary rooms apparently empty. There was no need for a door to open in the night. There was no need for a window to break. The stranger was already inside. On October 17th, 1941, that secret existence ended. Peters encountered Coney's near the icebox. Contemporary retellings preserved through Denver historical sources describe the intruder as gaunt and disheveled. The man Peters saw in his home was not a shadow glimpsed through a window. He was close enough to confront, close enough for there to be no uncertainty about what was happening. Another human being had been living where he did not belong. The confrontation became violent. Accounts describe Peters resisting with a cane. Coney's attacked him at one point using an old pistol before turning to a heavy cast iron stove shaker. Later reports placed the number of blows at more than 35. The violence spread through the home with such force that investigators would find a scene entirely inconsistent with a quiet burglary. Then the fighting stopped. Peters did not get up. The house became still again. And Coney's did something that transformed the murder from a brutal killing into one of Denver's most disturbing hidden occupant cases. He went back upstairs. He climbed through the small opening. He returned to the cramped space above the dead man's home. Approximately an hour later, neighbors became concerned when Peters failed to appear as expected. They went looking for him and discovered what had happened. Police were called. Officers searched the house for the person responsible. They found the victim. They found evidence of violence. They did not find Theodore Coney's. There was no clear evidence showing how a murderer could have entered, killed Peters, and vanished. Nothing about the house gave investigators the simple explanation they needed. The obvious places could be examined, doors could be checked, windows could be considered, rooms could be entered. The killer was still beyond them, above them. The investigation moved outward because investigators had no reason to understand that the answer remained inside. Detectives examined Peters' life and searched for someone who might have wanted him dead. The absence of a straightforward robbery motive made the killing stranger. Reports noted that money had been left behind. Meanwhile, the man who knew precisely what had happened remained concealed in the building. Helen Peters eventually left the hospital and returned to the house as a widow. A friend stayed with her to help while she recovered. It was then that the house began acquiring another reputation. Food went missing. Objects were displaced. Unexplained sounds came from inside the home. Those details were not being reported by people exploring an abandoned building decades afterward. They were being noticed while the investigation into Philip Peters' murder was still unresolved. There was a practical explanation for every disturbance. Someone was hungry. Someone was moving. Someone was listening for the moment when the rooms below became safe enough to enter. But without that knowledge, the disturbances could suggest something entirely different. The friend helping Helen reportedly became convinced that the house was haunted and eventually left. Helen later moved to Grand Junction to live with her son. The home that had contained a marriage, music lessons, meals, and familiar routines was increasingly associated with the inexplicable. Then it stood vacant. Still, the disturbances continued. Neighbors reported strange noises. They reported offensive smells. There were accounts of movement inside a house where nobody was supposed to be living. Police responded more than once and searched. Again, nothing. Coney's had a hiding place designed not by careful engineering, but by its own impossibility. The opening was small, the space above it was miserable. A normal resident had little reason to imagine that another adult could remain compressed inside it for month after month. That assumption protected him. Each time the house returned to silence, the man above the ceiling remained. By July of 1942, Denver police changed their approach. Detectives Roy Bloxam and Bill Jackson were stationed outside the property to watch it instead of simply responding after neighbors reported another disturbance. Eventually, they saw a man inside. They entered. Once again, the room seemed empty. Then came a sound from upstairs. The officers moved toward it. Inside a closet, they saw something disappearing through a small opening overhead. Legs. For months, people had heard noises without finding their source. They had smelled something foul without locating it. A woman had left believing the house was haunted, searches had failed, a murderer had apparently vanished from a locked domestic world. Now, the thing disappearing into the ceiling had human legs. The officers grabbed them. They pulled downward, and Theodore Coneys came out of the attic. The hidden space explained what the house itself had been unable to explain. Police sent an officer into the attic to examine where Coneys had been living. What he found made the physical reality of those months difficult to dismiss as merely clever concealment. Coneys had created what was described as a nest inside the cramped area. Human waste had been collected there. He had apparently gone without bathing. The odor was strong enough that the officer investigating the space became physically sick and vomited. Afterward, Officer Fred Zarnow made the observation that would give the case its lasting name. A man, he said in substance, would have to be a spider to tolerate such a place. Newspapers turned Theodore Coneys into the Denver Spider-Man. But the nickname softened something that was far more disturbing without it. There had been no extraordinary creature in the attic. There had been no phantom. There had been no supernatural force moving objects and stealing food. There had been a man lying only a ceiling away from ordinary domestic life, waiting until the people underneath him were gone. After his arrest, Coneys confessed. He told police that he had initially entered the Peters home looking for food and had used the attic as a place to hide. He described the killing as a decision made in panic after Peters discovered him. In October of 1942, Coneys was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Cañon City. He remained incarcerated until his death in 1967. The legal case ended. The image did not. It remained because the horror was not limited to the moment Philip Peters encountered Coneys beside the icebox. The deeper horror had begun before that moment and continued long afterward. It existed each time Peters believed he was alone. It existed whenever he moved from one room to another without knowing that another person could hear him through the structure of the house. It existed when food disappeared after the murder. It existed when Helen returned home and heard sounds she could not explain. It existed when helpers looked through rooms and found nothing. It existed when neighbors watched a supposedly empty house and sensed that something inside was wrong. And it existed in the narrow darkness above them where the explanation waited without announcing itself. The house on West Moncrief Place became remembered in local accounts as a ghost house, but its secret required nothing supernatural. That was precisely what made the story endure. A haunting allows distance. A ghost belongs to another world. It can be imagined as mist, memory, or superstition. Theodore Coneys was alive. He needed food. He produced footsteps. He displaced objects. He left an odor. He listened. And when people entered the rooms below, he knew enough to become silent. The noises that frightened the household were real. The missing food was real. The shape moving through the supposedly vacant house was real. The man above the ceiling was real. For the people who later repeated the story, the most difficult part was never simply that a murderer had escaped immediate capture. It was where he had gone. He had not fled into Denver. He had not vanished down an alley. He had not crossed the state line. After Philip Peters was killed, Theodore Coneys climbed back into the house itself. For months afterward, whenever the rooms below seemed empty, the attic was not, and every unexplained sound had been coming from someone who was waiting for the house to become quiet again. Something was waiting on Route 112. Route 112 cuts through northern New Hampshire with the kind of darkness that seems different from ordinary night. In winter, the road narrows between snowbanks and black walls of trees, bending through small settlements before disappearing again beneath pine and bare hardwood. Houses become infrequent, streetlights vanish. Beyond the reach of headlights, the forest offers no depth and no scale, only trunks standing close together until they merge into a single dark surface. On the evening of February 9, 2004, somewhere along that road, 21-year-old Maura Murray reached the last confirmed place from which she would ever be seen. Earlier that day, Maura had left the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she was studying nursing. She had not told the people close to her that she was making the drive north. Surveillance footage from an automated teller machine showed her wearing jeans and a dark jacket. Investigators would later establish that she had traveled roughly 2.5 hours from Amherst toward the White Mountains, a region she knew from hiking and family trips. What she intended to do there has never been conclusively established. By evening, daylight had drained from the valleys, snow covered portions of the roads around Haverhill, New Hampshire. The mountains and forest absorbed what little light remained from scattered homes, and Route 112 became a narrow strip of pavement running through a landscape that offered almost nowhere to go once a vehicle stopped moving. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Maura's black Saturn left the roadway near a curve on Route 112 and became stuck after what authorities described as an apparent single-car accident. The car remained close to the roadway, visible enough that nearby residents noticed something had happened. There was no mystery yet. There was only a stranded car on a winter road. Then someone stopped. A local school bus driver encountered the young woman at the Saturn and spoke with her. He offered assistance. Maura declined. According to accounts of the encounter, she indicated that help had already been contacted. The bus driver eventually continued to his nearby home and contacted authorities himself. That conversation became one of the final confirmed human contacts associated with Maura Murray. It also established something that would become deeply unsettling afterward. She was still there. She was alive. She was beside the car. And then, within a remarkably small window of time, she was gone. The darkness surrounding the crash site mattered because it left few comfortable possibilities. Route 112 was not a brightly illuminated commercial road where a person could disappear into a restaurant, store, parking lot, or crowd. The road was bordered by homes and places, but beyond them stretched woods, snow, uneven ground, and long sections of winter darkness. A person stepping away from the roadway could become difficult to see almost immediately. Headlights passing around the curve would illuminate the snow for several seconds, drag shadows across the trunks, then vanish. Darkness would close again. Nothing in the official record establishes that Maura entered those woods. Nothing establishes that she remained on the road. Nothing establishes that another vehicle stopped for her after the bus driver left. Those unanswered possibilities occupy the few minutes at the center of the case. And those few minutes are where the story becomes frightening without requiring anything supernatural at all. There is, however, one element of the horror premise surrounding this retelling that cannot be presented as documented fact. No verified witness statement or official account says Maura reported seeing a person standing among the trees with a flashlight. No established evidence shows that a light flashed 3 times from the forest. Whatever happened during the unobserved portion of that night, Maura left no account explaining what she saw. That detail belongs to the imagined nightmare surrounding the blank space, not to the confirmed evidence. Yet the image is disturbing precisely because of the landscape in which she disappeared. The stranded Saturn sits near the road. Its engine has stopped. The ordinary warmth of the passenger compartment begins to fade. Cold presses against the windows. Snow along the shoulder reflects weak light from the vehicle, but several yards beyond it, the forest is nearly featureless. A person standing near the car would be able to see the beginning of the trees, not necessarily what stood between them. In the horror version of those missing minutes, there is eventually a point of light beyond the roadside. Small, white, motionless, too far inside the trees to illuminate a face. At first, it resembles the beam of a flashlight pointed toward the ground. Someone might reasonably interpret it as another resident approaching through the woods, perhaps a person who had noticed the accident and was taking a shortcut toward the road, but the light does not approach. It remains where it is. The darkness around it makes distance difficult to judge. It might be several dozen yards away, it might be farther. Tree trunks interrupt the view whenever the light moves slightly, making it disappear and return. Then it goes out, the road becomes empty again. Several moments pass. The light appears once, disappears. Appears a second time, disappears. Then appears a third time. 3 separate flashes. Not the wandering movement of someone searching for footing. Not a beam sweeping through branches. 3 deliberate appearances from the same general place in the woods. After the third, darkness. In that imagined version, no voice calls from the trees. Nobody says that help is coming. Nobody walks toward the disabled car. The light has done only one thing. It has made itself visible. The implication is worse than an approaching stranger because an approaching stranger has an understandable purpose. Someone offering assistance comes to the road, someone checking an accident announces himself, someone carrying a flashlight through winter woods normally uses the beam continuously to see the ground. A person who remains hidden and signals from darkness is asking the stranded traveler to close the distance instead. The forest around Route 112 would have swallowed the sound of cautious footsteps quickly. Snow and roadside debris would have changed beneath each step. Branches would catch clothing. The glow of the Saturn would weaken behind the trees until only fragments of road remained visible between trunks. A few yards farther in, the car could disappear completely. That scene is not evidence of what happened to Maura Murray. What follows in the documented record is somehow more disturbing because it provides no scene at all. Authorities arrived shortly after the accident was reported. The Saturn was still there. Maura was not. The road did not contain an obvious answer explaining where she had gone. There was no confirmed person waiting beside the car. There was no confirmed destination she had reached. There was no later verified telephone call explaining that she was safe. A young woman who had been seen beside her vehicle only minutes earlier had disappeared from the scene. The silence after that discovery expanded rapidly. Searchers examined the surrounding area. Law enforcement, search teams, family members, and private citizens would return to the region repeatedly over the years. Woods were searched, nearby areas were examined, leads emerged and collapsed. The case accumulated theories faster than it accumulated answers. The terrain itself became part of nearly every explanation. If she had gone into the woods, where was the trace? If she had continued along the road, who had seen her? If she had accepted a ride, who had stopped? Each possibility seemed capable of explaining her absence. None has been conclusively established. Winter wilderness can conceal things, but Route 112 was not untouched backcountry. People lived nearby, vehicles traveled through, search efforts followed. The longer the investigation continued without locating Maura, the more disturbing the short interval between the crash and the arrival of police became. The mystery was not simply that someone disappeared in northern New Hampshire. It was how little time seemed necessary for it to happen. Maura was an experienced runner. She enjoyed hiking in the White Mountains. She was not unfamiliar with demanding terrain. Those facts created still more questions. A strong runner could cover distance quickly, even though winter conditions would make movement more difficult. A person attempting to avoid attention could leave the immediate crash area before responding officers arrived. A passing vehicle could carry someone miles away in the same amount of time. But every explanation creates another blank space. There is no confirmed account showing where the movement ended. Only the starting point remains. A black Saturn. A winter road. A young woman seen alive near it. Then absence. Years passed. The road remained. Snow fell over the curve during other winters. It melted in spring. Leaves returned to the trees. Travelers drove through Haverhill without experiencing anything unusual. Searches continued, sometimes renewing hope that some physical answer might finally emerge from the landscape. None produced a confirmed resolution. In February of 2024, 2 decades after the disappearance, New Hampshire authorities issued an age-progressed image of Maura as part of continuing investigative efforts. The case remained open. The official description was still painfully simple. Her car had left Route 112. A private citizen had spoken with a woman believed to be Maura at the scene. When police arrived, she was gone. No official document filled the darkness between those events. That emptiness is why the road lends itself so easily to darker stories. A light between trees, a vehicle slowing beside the shoulder, someone watching from beyond the snowbank, footsteps moving where headlights cannot reach. Those images endure because the real case contains something more frightening than any invented creature. It contains opportunity. For several minutes on a cold New Hampshire night, a young woman stood beside a disabled vehicle on a lonely road, while darkness surrounded nearly everything beyond the nearest houses. Then the window closed. Whatever Maura Murray encountered after her final confirmed conversation, she did not return to the Saturn before authorities arrived. She did not appear at the next house with an explanation. She did not contact her family to say where she had gone, and despite repeated searches, investigators have not established what happened after she left the crash scene. The forest beside Route 112 keeps no testimony. The road offers no memory. There is only the knowledge that one moment Maura was there, close enough to speak with another person, and shortly afterward there was nothing beside the Saturn except an abandoned vehicle and winter darkness. The imagined flashlight in the trees does not need to be true to expose what makes the real disappearance so unsettling. The terrible part is that nobody knows whether something drew Maura away. Nobody knows whether she walked toward danger, climbed voluntarily into a vehicle, tried to hide temporarily, continued down the road, or made some other decision that has never been reconstructed. The official record stops almost at the exact moment when the most important part of the story begins. That is where Route 112 becomes more than a location. It becomes a boundary. On one side is everything that can still be documented. A university student, a drive north, a snowy road, a crash, a brief conversation, an approaching police response. On the other side is a darkness that has lasted for more than 2 decades, and somewhere inside those missing minutes is the answer. Whether it was waiting on the road, inside a passing vehicle, beyond the snowbanks, or nowhere anyone has yet thought to look, no verified account has ever brought it back into the light. The children the fire couldn't find. Long before the mystery became something people whispered about, there was only a house outside Fayetteville, West Virginia, and a family preparing for Christmas. The air on Christmas Eve of 1945 was cold enough to freeze water solid outdoors. Inside the Sauter home, lights glowed against the darkness while George and Jenny Sauter spent the evening with 9 of their 10 children. Nothing about the house suggested that before sunrise it would be gone, or that 5 of the children sleeping beneath its roof would leave behind a question that survived the building itself. George Sauter had built a prosperous life in West Virginia after arriving in the United States from Sardinia as a boy. He operated a trucking business and raised 10 children with Jenny, who had also come from an Italian immigrant family. Their home was busy, crowded, and familiar, the kind of place where voices carried between rooms and children knew every staircase in darkness. George was known for speaking openly about politics, including his contempt for Benito Mussolini, and those arguments had occasionally become heated within the local Italian community. Months before the fire, according to accounts later assembled by the family, a man selling insurance had become angry with George and warned that his house would burn and his children would be destroyed. There had been other moments that seemed meaningless until afterward. A stranger looking for hauling work had wandered near the rear of the house and pointed toward the electrical system, predicting that it would someday cause a fire. George found the warning strange because the wiring had recently been inspected and judged satisfactory. Shortly before Christmas, members of the family also remembered seeing a man sitting in a parked vehicle and watching the younger Sodder children as they returned from school. None of those incidents stopped Christmas from arriving normally. Only later would the family arrange them in memory like objects found scattered around a dark room. That Christmas Eve, the younger children were allowed to remain awake after the adults began preparing for bed. Maurice was 14, Martha was 12. Louis was 9, Jenny was 8, and Betty was 5. They had asked permission to stay up longer, and their mother believed they would eventually go upstairs when they were finished. The house settled gradually into the quiet of early Christmas morning. Then the telephone rang. It was shortly after midnight when Jenny answered. A woman she did not recognize asked for someone whose name meant nothing to her. Jenny could hear laughter and the sound of glasses in the background. She told the caller that she had reached the wrong number and hung up. Police would later identify the caller, who maintained that she had simply dialed incorrectly, but in the darkness of that house, the interruption became the first unmistakable disturbance of the night. Before returning to bed, Jenny noticed things the children were supposed to have taken care of. The downstairs lights were still burning, curtains remained open, the front door had not been locked. Marion, one of the older daughters, was asleep on a sofa. Jenny assumed the 5 younger children had gone upstairs, so she shut off the lights, closed the house, and returned to her bedroom. There was still no reason to think that anything beyond an ordinary Christmas night was taking place. As she began to drift back towards sleep, a sound struck the roof. It was hard and sudden, followed by something rolling overhead. Jenny heard it clearly enough to remember it afterward. Nothing immediately followed, and the house became quiet again. She remained in bed. Roughly half an hour later, she woke for the 3rd time, but there was no telephone now and no mysterious impact above her. There was smoke entering the room. The fire had already taken hold downstairs. George and Jenny began shouting for their children while the interior filled with smoke and heat. Their youngest child, 2-year-old Sylvia, was carried to safety. Marion escaped along with George Jr. and John. The older boys came through the burning house with their hair singed. But when the family gathered outside in the freezing darkness, 5 names had no answers. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, Betty. George believed they were still upstairs. Between the children and the ground was a staircase already consumed by fire. He broke a window trying to force his way back into the house and badly cut his arm, but smoke and flames filled the rooms beyond the glass. He called for the children. No face appeared at an upstairs window. No small figure emerged through the smoke. The family could see the house burning, but they could not see the 5 children they believed were inside it. George ran to the place where he normally kept a ladder against the house. It was gone. The ladder represented something brutally simple. If the staircase could not be used, the upstairs windows might still be reached from outside. But the ladder that was normally available was not where it belonged. It was later found away from the house, down an embankment. With the roof and upper floor increasingly surrounded by fire, every alternative became more desperate than the one before it. George owned coal trucks. He could move one beneath the windows and climb onto the vehicle. He went to start one. The engine did not respond. He tried the other truck. That one would not start either, although both had reportedly been working before the fire. George then turned toward a rain barrel, hoping for water, and discovered that the winter cold had frozen it solid. The house was burning only yards away, while every practical means of reaching the upper floor seemed to disappear one after another. There was still the fire department, but Fayetteville did not have the emergency system a modern town would recognize. Marion ran to a neighbor's house and tried to telephone for help. An operator could not be reached. Another neighbor attempted a call from a nearby tavern and encountered the same problem. Eventually, someone drove into town and located Fire Chief F.J. Morris, after which firefighters had to be summoned through a telephone chain, one volunteer contacting another. The station was only about 2.5 miles away, but the department did not arrive until around 8 a.m. By then, the Sodder home had collapsed into a burned basement and smoking debris. The family had spent the remaining darkness outside, confronting a conclusion that seemed unavoidable. 5 children had apparently been trapped in a burning wooden house. George and Jenny initially believed they were dead. Yet the search on Christmas morning produced something that disturbed that conclusion almost immediately. Authorities did not recover 5 identifiable bodies. The expected skeletons were not laid out from the ruins. There were no remains that could be shown to the parents and identified as Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Fire Chief Morris suggested that the heat had been sufficient to destroy the bodies. A state police inspector attributed the fire to faulty electrical wiring, and a coroner's jury accepted the deaths of the missing children. Death certificates were issued listing fire or suffocation as their causes of death. The official answer was therefore simple enough to understand. The children had been upstairs, the house had burned, the children had died with it. But the simplicity of that answer began to trouble Jenny. She knew what had survived in the basement. Recognizable pieces of household equipment remained among the ruins. She began testing the idea of complete destruction herself, burning animal bones and examining what remained afterward. Charred bones survived her experiments. She also learned that ordinary cremation did not simply cause an entire skeleton to vanish. The more she examined the absence in the ruins, the harder it became for her to accept that 5 children had disappeared into fire without leaving unmistakable physical evidence behind. Other details returned with new weight. A telephone repair worker reportedly told the Sodders that their telephone line had been cut rather than burned through. The family remembered electrical lights still functioning while the house was burning, something they considered inconsistent with the official explanation involving faulty wiring. A witness later reported seeing a man near the fire removing a block and tackle and equipment used around engines. That man eventually admitted stealing the equipment, but denied having anything to do with the blaze. Each fact seemed to touch the next without forming a complete picture. Then there was the object found in the yard. Young Sylvia discovered a hard rubber object near the burned property. Jenny remembered the violent impact on the roof and the rolling noise before the fire began. George came to believe the object could have been part of an incendiary device. It was an interpretation rather than a proven explanation, but by then, the family's suspicion had moved far beyond electrical wiring. To George and Jenny, the fire increasingly looked less like the event that had killed their children and more like something intended to hide what had happened to them. The reports that followed were more disturbing because they placed the children outside the house. One woman claimed she had seen the missing children looking from a passing automobile while the Sodder home was burning. Another woman who operated a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston said she served breakfast to children she believed were the missing siblings on the morning after the fire. She also remembered a vehicle with Florida license plates. Later, a woman working at a Charleston hotel reported seeing 4 children resembling the missing Sodders with adults who prevented her from speaking freely with them. None of those sightings produced proof, and none ultimately brought a child home. George and Jenny refused to stop searching. In 1947, they appealed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director J. Brang, Edgar Hoover responded that the matter was considered local and outside the Bureau's investigative jurisdiction, although federal agents indicated they could assist if local authorities permitted it. That cooperation never developed. The Sodders hired private investigators instead and followed reports wherever they appeared, sometimes traveling great distances for a single possibility. The physical evidence remained just as strange. In August of 1949, the family arranged a new excavation of the former house site. Investigators recovered several pieces of vertebrae and sent them to the Smithsonian Institution for examination. The bones came from one individual whose skeletal development was judged most consistent with someone roughly 16 to 22 years old. Maurice, the oldest of the 5 missing children, had been 14. More troubling to the family, the vertebrae showed no evidence of fire exposure, and Smithsonian specialists considered it likely that they had entered the site with the dirt George had used to cover the basement after the fire. The excavation therefore returned the mystery almost to where it had begun. 5 children were officially dead. 5 bodies still had not been identified. The state eventually considered further investigation hopeless and closed the matter. George and Jenny did the opposite. They erected a large billboard along Route 16 bearing photographs of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Drivers passing through Fayetteville saw the children's faces year after year. A reward was offered for information. The billboard transformed a private loss into a permanent question standing beside the road. The leads continued for decades. There were claims that Martha had been seen in a convent. There were reports from Texas and Florida. George traveled to investigate possibilities and repeatedly returned without his children. Then, in the late 1960s, an envelope arrived with a Kentucky postmark. Inside was a photograph of a young man whose dark curly hair, eyes, nose, and eyebrow reminded George and Jenny painfully of Louis, who had been 9 years old when the house burned. A cryptic message on the back included Louis Sodder's name. The identity of the man in the photograph was never established. The family hired another private investigator and sent him toward Kentucky. They never heard from him again. George died in 1969 without learning what happened to the 5 children. Jenny remained convinced that they had not died in the house. She wore black in mourning and continued living with the unanswered disappearance until her death in 1989. Only then did the weathered billboard finally come down. For decades, it had stood beside the road with 5 young faces fixed at the ages they had been on Christmas Eve, while everyone who loved them grew old. No verified later life was ever established for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, or Betty. No confirmed abduction was proved. No definitive physical evidence demonstrated where the 5 children went after the fire began. Fire professionals have argued that the children probably died in the blaze and that the early search was inadequate, while the Sodder family maintained that the absence of convincing remains and the strange circumstances surrounding the night pointed somewhere beyond the ruins. The historical record preserves both the official conclusion and the family's refusal to accept it. That is what leaves the Sodder case colder than the December air surrounding the house. The horror is not simply that a family watched its home burn on Christmas morning. It is that when daylight finally reached the ruins, the fire had left enough behind to prove that a house had existed, enough debris to search, enough questions to occupy investigators for years, but nothing that could unquestionably return 5 children to their parents. Somewhere between the ringing telephone, the sound on the roof, the missing ladder, the stalled trucks, the delayed firefighters, and the empty ashes, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty disappeared from the documented world. The flames destroyed the house. They never explained where the children went.